I found the letter by accident, the way you find a spare key you forgot you owned. I was sorting old files in my house in San Francisco, trying to clear a shelf that had turned into a museum of later, when a brittle German envelope slid out from the back of a metal box. The postmark read 1945. I opened it expecting paperwork and got one plain sentence instead. In Munich, one orphan boy was taken out, and another was left behind. And the boy left behind was named Heinrich. The result was, it stuck in my head like a tune you can't shake. The cost was that I couldn't toss the envelope back and move on, not after I'd seen that name. And by the time my coffee went cold, I'd booked a flight to Germany. Munich in 1945 did not look like a place where a child could grow into anything except hunger. 10-year-old Klaus moved through broken streets with Heinrich because staying paired made them harder to separate, and separation was the city's fastest way to kill you without firing a shot. The result of walking together was that they could share watchfulness and share scraps, and sometimes share the timing of fear so it didn't swallow them at the same moment. The cost was that every hour together made Heinrich's presence feel like a vital organ, which meant losing him would feel like being torn open. They learned early that adults were not a steady force, just a weather system with boots. A uniform could mean help at noon, and violence by dusk, and children had no way to argue with either. Klaus watched a man get knocked down for cutting a line, and watched 3 boys strip a weaker boy of bread while the crowd pretended not to see because seeing was a risk. The result was a rule Klaus and Heinrich followed with discipline. Wait, keep your hands visible, and never let anyone see fear. The cost was that the rule trained them to swallow anger until anger became useless and hard to find. They survived on repetition because repetition was the closest thing left to order. They lined up for watery soup, accepted a half crust without complaint, and slept in rooms that were never designed to hold bodies. Klaus counted meals the way he would later count parts on a workbench, because counting made the day feel measurable, and measurable felt safer than chaos. The result was a small sense of progress, even when nothing improved. The cost was that he began to see himself the way the city saw him, not as a boy, but as an item waiting to be processed. One afternoon, the line moved too slowly, and Heinrich's knees started to buckle, and Klaus tried to hold him up without making it obvious. A soldier stepped out from the edge of the crowd and watched the children instead of watching the street, and Klaus noticed him because his movements looked deliberate, like someone who still believed reasons mattered. The soldier spoke German carefully, asked names, and kept his voice low the way you do when you don't want to trigger panic. The result was that Klaus and Heinrich were singled out from the mass that had learned to be invisible. The cost was that being seen meant being moved, and being moved meant losing control. The soldier's name was Michael Chen, though Klaus wouldn't learn it until later. Michael did not offer comfort first. He offered direction. He told the boys to stay close, to answer only what they were asked, and he used the authority of his uniform to push them past a guard who would have turned them away. The result was entry into a temporary intake center where someone might register them instead of letting them drift. The cost was that Klaus had to trust a stranger, because there was no other option that improved the odds. Inside the intake building, the air smelled of wet coats and old smoke, and the noise was the dull grind of too many people waiting for too few decisions. Children sat on the floor in rows while clerks with clipboards wrote names with the speed of people trying to keep up with the disaster. A woman asked Klaus his name, wrote it down wrong, and reached for the next child without looking up. Klaus corrected her, and she frowned as if a child's insistence was an insult. The result was a confrontation Klaus did not want. The cost was that a wrong spelling could erase him later, and he knew he could not afford that kind of erasure. Michael stepped in and made the clerk rewrite it. He repeated the letters slowly until the woman wrote them the way Klaus said they belonged, and he did not soften his voice because softness did not move bureaucracy. The result was that Klaus's name matched his mouth and his body for the first time in months. The cost was that Klaus learned survival could depend on another person's willingness to be difficult on your behalf, and that dependence felt like a debt. Heinrich's turn came, and the clerk wrote his name with a quick slash of pencil, then moved on. Heinrich watched the pencil like it was a blade, because a name on paper was the difference between being a person and being a problem. Klaus leaned close and whispered the spelling anyway, not because the clerk needed it, but because Heinrich needed to hear someone care. The result was a fragile kind of steadiness in Heinrich's breathing. The cost was that Klaus began taking responsibility for things he had no real power to control. Michael walked them to a holding room and argued with an official whose face looked permanently worn down by bad choices. Klaus did not understand the adult words, but he understood the structure. Michael was trying to force the system to keep the two boys in the same stream, and the official was resisting because resistance was easier than responsibility. The result was time. Minutes of delay bought by someone else's effort. The cost was that delay created resentment, and resentment inside a system could become paperwork with teeth. When Michael returned, he told them they were being transferred to a larger facility on the edge of the city where food was more reliable and sleeping did not require constant movement. He said it like a fact, not a promise, and Klaus clung to it anyway because facts were the only promises adults still made. The result was hope shaped into a root. The cost was that roots could break without warning, and hope built on roots could collapse in one stamp of a form. The truck that carried them out of the intake center was crowded with other children, and the ride was silent because silence drew less attention. Klaus held the side rail and used his shoulder to keep Heinrich upright when the truck hit holes in the road. The result was that Heinrich stayed on his feet and did not fall into the crush. The cost was that Klaus's arm went numb, and he learned that protecting someone meant accepting pain without complaint. At the new facility, staff tried to separate children by age and by size because sorting made their workload simpler. Klaus and Heinrich were almost split at the door, and Michael intervened again, pointing at their papers, speaking fast, forcing a decision the staff did not want to make. The result was that Klaus and Heinrich stayed together for one more phase of processing. The cost was that Klaus began to rely on Michael's voice as if it were a map, and relying on a map you don't own is its own kind of danger. Days moved by in the same pattern: roll calls, thin meals, cold water, and the constant fear of being transferred without warning. Klaus kept his head down and his eyes open, and Heinrich kept his mouth shut and his hands ready to grab what mattered. The result was that they survived long enough for the next change. The cost was that survive did not mean safe, and safety was always temporary and rented. The change came in the form of a list. A woman read names and pointed children toward doors, and the adults treated the list like a solution instead of a weapon. Klaus heard Heinrich's name and saw the woman point left, then heard his own name and saw her point right. The result was a split created by a sentence and a hand gesture. The cost was a surge of panic so sharp Klaus felt it like pain in his teeth. Heinrich grabbed Klaus's sleeve with a grip that did not belong to a child. A staff member pried Heinrich's fingers away one by one because her job was to keep the line moving, not to protect a friendship. Michael entered the room at the moment the grip broke, and Klaus saw the calculation in his face before he heard the explanation. There was one vetted placement through a church network tied to families overseas, and there was room for one child now, not two. The result was that the split was framed as a constraint, not a choice. The cost was that Klaus could not fight a constraint the way you fight a person. Michael dropped to Klaus's level and spoke quietly, as if volume could reduce damage. He said Heinrich would be transferred again and tracked through registry numbers, and he said he would keep Heinrich's name written correctly in his own notes. The result was a narrow bridge of information across an ocean of fear. The cost was that Klaus knew bridges like that could fail without anyone being evil, and that made them terrifying. Klaus did the only thing a child could do with a choice he wasn't allowed to make. He tried to force time to stop. He stepped toward Heinrich, reached out, and Michael caught his shoulder, not hard, but firm enough to steer him like a piece on a board. The result was that Klaus was directed toward the right side door. The cost was that Klaus felt in his body the moment his life became something someone else decided. Heinrich did not cry. He stared at Michael with a hard, exhausted focus and said one sentence that burned into Klaus because it sounded like a command and a plea at the same time. "Don't let him forget me." Michael nodded once. The result was a promise made in the smallest possible motion. The cost was that Klaus understood a promise like that was not protection. It was a burden carried forward. As Klaus was pushed through the door, he made his own decision, the kind of decision a child makes when he has no leverage and still refuses to be erased. He scraped his thumbnail hard across the inside of his palm until it hurt and kept scraping, carving rough marks into skin he could feel even with his eyes shut. He counted the letters of Heinrich's name in his head as he did it, forcing the sound into a rhythm that would stick. The result was that Heinrich's name became pain, and pain is hard to lose. The cost was that Klaus built a lifetime obligation into his own hand, and he would carry it whether he wanted to or not. The transfer happened fast because systems move faster than grief. Klaus was put in a truck with other children marked for overseas processing, and a guard kept their faces pointed forward like that would prevent trouble. Klaus tried to turn his head for one last look, but a hand pushed him straight again. The result was that his last image of Heinrich was not a face, but an absence. The cost was that the absence became a shape Klaus would spend decades trying to fill. Michael stayed close during the next steps, not like a savior, but like a man trying to keep a fragile plan from breaking. Klaus saw him argue with clerks, check papers, correct spellings, and lean on his uniform when the uniform was the only tool available. The result was that Klaus stayed on the right list and did not vanish into a clerical mistake. The cost was that Klaus's survival depended on a stranger's stamina, and Klaus could not control how long that stamina would last. Months later, Klaus was moved again. Train, bus, then a room full of other children where adults spoke in tones meant to sound kind and only sounded foreign. He learned a few English words because they were repeated until they felt like orders, and he learned to answer to Klaus even when the pronunciation changed. The result was that he became portable, the kind of child a system could move across borders. The cost was that portability demanded silence about the things that couldn't travel, like Heinrich. When he finally boarded a plane, he did not understand what America was. He understood only that he was leaving the place where Heinrich existed in the same air. He pressed his palm against his thigh and felt the rough marks he had carved months earlier. The result was a physical reminder that he was not allowed to let the name go. The cost was that the reminder hurt, and the hurt made him resent the very obligation that also kept him human. On the other side of the ocean, the rules changed, but the price stayed the same. Klaus was given regular meals and a bed that did not need defending, and he was given school and structure and adults who tried hard to be gentle. He was also given a new story that fit better in polite rooms. War orphan, rescued, adopted, grateful. The result was that he learned how to perform the story people wanted. The cost was that the performance required leaving Heinrich out, and every time Klaus left Heinrich out, the name in his palm felt heavier. Years turned into decades, and Klaus built a life that looked stable because he needed stability to feel real. He studied, became an engineer, and learned to trust diagrams and numbers because numbers didn't pretend. He married Irene, raised children, and became the kind of father who fixed problems before they spread. The result was a successful, orderly life in California. The cost was a crack inside him that never sealed. He had been taken out, and someone had been left behind. He kept the crack quiet by staying busy, and busyness worked until it didn't. When his children asked where he came from, he gave them safe answers. Germany, the war, adoption. Because safe answers stopped questions. The result was family peace. The cost was that each safe answer trimmed away a truth that would eventually demand space. He did not write to Heinrich because he had no address, and because part of him feared that searching would make the loss official. He told himself the system had tracked Heinrich and that Heinrich had grown up somewhere in the rebuilt city, and he treated that hope like a private superstition. The result was that he could live without collapsing. The cost was that he lived with a debt that never collected interest until the day it did. That day arrived in the form of a brittle envelope in a file box, decades late and still sharp. Klaus read the sentence again, and this time the words didn't feel like history. They felt like a hand on his shoulder steering him toward a door. The result was that his past stopped being complicated and became actionable. The cost was that he had to go back and settle a debt the child in Munich had carved into his own skin. Klaus flew to Munich with the letter folded flat like a warrant and the old photograph tucked into the same folder as his passport. He landed in a city that looked clean, organized, and rebuilt into something the war could not interrupt anymore. The result was immediate disorientation. The place that had made him did not look like the place he remembered or the place his body expected. The cost was that he understood he wouldn't find Heinrich by staring at buildings and waiting for nostalgia to behave. He tried once anyway, because ritual is hard to kill. He went to a modern square where the letter's references suggested an intake site had once stood, and he held up the photograph and tried to match angles like a man looking for a missing bolt. The result was total failure. Glass walls and cafes, no rubble, no scar, no outline that fit. The cost was a familiar emptiness, the same emptiness he'd felt when adults in 1945 said, "This is how it has to be." He changed tactics because stubbornness without method was just another form of panic. Klaus chose the shortest path that could still work. He went to a tracing office connected to long-running post-war records, showed the letter, and asked one thing: whether there was any living contact for Heinrich tied to that name and that year. The result was a file opened and a promise that someone would search. The cost was that he had to sit with uncertainty again, the same kind of uncertainty that had ruled his childhood. Except now he had money and still no control. While he waited, he walked through neighborhoods rebuilt during the boom years after the war, blocks so orderly they looked designed to erase memory on purpose. He watched people pedal bicycles, carry groceries, laugh outside restaurants, and live inside the clean continuity Heinrich had described in his imagination for decades. The result was a deeper understanding of what he had missed. Not heroism, not drama, just uninterrupted life. The cost was that uninterrupted life made his own life feel like a successful repair job, functional, strong, and still visibly patched. He called Irene from his hotel because he needed a voice that belonged to the present. He told her what he had done: office, file, waiting, because speaking and actions kept his throat from tightening. The result was that Irene could anchor him without trying to control him. The cost was that she reminded him of what he could not ignore. If he came home with nothing but pain, his children would inherit confusion instead of a story. On the third day, the tracing office called. A woman's voice gave him a phone number and said carefully that the match was probable but not guaranteed, and that a man at that number had lived in the right district for decades. The result was a concrete object, a number that could turn probability into reality. The cost was that Klaus had to decide whether he wanted reality, because reality could be cruel in ways probability wasn't. He dialed. The ring sounded ordinary, which made it worse because ordinary meant the past had become someone's routine. A man answered in German with a voice that carried age and work. Klaus said his own name, then the orphan facility name, then Heinrich, and he heard himself pause on the last word, as if the pause could protect him. The result was a long silence that made his throat tighten. The cost was that silence let him picture every possible outcome at once. Then the man said, "I haven't heard that name in a long time." The result was confirmation without warmth, the kind that tells you you're on the right road, but not whether the road ends safely. The cost was that Klaus felt the old panic rise, and this time he couldn't blame hunger for it. Klaus forced the next step because hesitation had cost him too much already. He asked if the man would meet him, and he offered a time and a place, because he did not trust open-ended things anymore. The result was a yes that sounded cautious, not welcoming. The cost was that caution warned Klaus not to expect a reunion. It warned him to expect a reckoning. They met in a café that had survived by updating itself. Old wood, modern lighting, customers who could afford to sit. Klaus arrived early because arriving early was the only way he knew to buy control. He watched the door and tried to prepare for a face he had not seen in 70 years. The result was that preparation failed when Heinrich walked in, because time does not preserve people the way memory does. The cost was a brief, sharp grief for the boy Klaus had lost and the man he had never known. Heinrich was shorter than Klaus, thicker through the shoulders, with hands that looked like they had done physical work for decades. He carried himself like a man used to being useful, not admired, and he stopped at Klaus's table with the caution of someone approaching a machine he doesn't trust. The result was a handshake that was firm and quick, two men testing whether the floor was stable. The cost was that their bodies confirmed what their minds already knew. They were strangers with a shared injury. They sat and did small talk because small talk is how men check for cracks before they step forward. Heinrich asked about Klaus's travel, his hotel, whether he liked Munich now. Klaus answered with facts because facts did not betray emotion. The result was a few minutes of stability. The cost was that every safe minute delayed the thing that had pulled them into the same room. Heinrich moved first, and he spoke about staying in the way someone speaks about a machine that runs, not perfect, but continuous. Apprenticeship, factory work, marriage, children, bills, routines, life that kept going in the same language, on the same streets. The result was a portrait of continuity Klaus had never had, and hearing it made Klaus's chest tighten with a feeling that was half envy and half relief. The cost was that the portrait carried an accusation without speaking one. Heinrich had carried the continuity Klaus had been removed from. Klaus told his version without decorating it. Adoption, school, engineering, marriage, children, the story of a life rebuilt in a different country. The result was a narrative that sounded impressive and incomplete at the same time, like a resume missing its first page. The cost was that Klaus could hear his own omission. Heinrich's name sat behind every sentence, like a debt collector waiting for his turn. Heinrich looked at him and asked the question in the blunt way only old friends who aren't friends anymore can ask. "So what are you now?" he said. "German or American?" The result was that the conversation hit the wall Klaus had been avoiding for decades. The cost was immediate. Any answer that picked one side would sound like betrayal, and any answer that tried to be clever would sound like escape. Klaus felt the old urge to protect himself with competence, to turn the question into a discussion of paperwork and citizenship and timelines. He swallowed that urge because paperwork had taken enough from him already. The result was a decision to move instead of argue. The cost was that moving meant revealing what he actually needed, which was not to win the question, but to survive it. He said, "Come with me," and he paid the bill before Heinrich could reach for it, because Klaus needed to control at least one variable. The result was a change of setting that broke the cafe's pressure and forced the conversation to keep walking. The cost was that Heinrich had to decide whether to follow, and following meant accepting that Klaus was steering the next part. They walked to a high place where the city opened up under them, rebuilt blocks and clean lines stretching toward the horizon. Klaus chose it because he needed space. He could not say what he needed to say while trapped between walls and strangers. The result was open air, enough room for a hard truth to breathe. The cost was exposure. There was nowhere to hide on a viewpoint, no furniture to blame, no cafe noise to cover a shaky voice. Klaus rested his hands on the railing and felt, as he always did when he was cornered, the ghost of the marks he had once carved into his palm. He did not speak right away because he needed the answer to be plain enough that Heinrich could accept it and strong enough that Klaus could live inside it. The result was a pause that forced Heinrich to wait instead of interrupt. The cost was that the pause gave Klaus time to feel shame rise. Shame for leaving, shame for surviving, shame for needing this now. "I was a German boy," Klaus said, "and then I became an American man." The result was a sentence that admitted both facts without pretending they were easy. The cost was that it still didn't answer the question that mattered, and Klaus could feel Heinrich's patience thinning the way you feel weather turning. Klaus turned his head and looked directly at Heinrich, because looking away would turn his words into a performance. The boy who needed a street corner to prove he had a home, he said. He didn't survive the war, or maybe he did, and he grew into someone else. The result was that Klaus named the break, the point where identity stopped being inherited and became rebuilt. The cost was that naming the break meant admitting loss he had never allowed himself to admit. Heinrich watched him with the same hard focus he'd carried since childhood, and Klaus saw something he hadn't wanted to see. Heinrich's continuity had not been comfort. It had been weight. Heinrich had stayed, but staying meant carrying the ruins, carrying the rebuilding, carrying the shame and the routines and the silence that came with living where the war had happened. The result was a new respect that Klaus hadn't earned in the café. The cost was that respect required honesty instead of gratitude. "My home isn't a building," Klaus said. "It isn't a Munich address I can't find. It isn't even my house in San Francisco by itself." The result was the beginning of an answer that refused to fit into a checkbox. The cost was that refusing the checkbox meant Klaus had to explain himself without the protection of a simple label. He kept his voice steady by grounding it in actions, not theories. "It's the fact that someone in 1945 looked at two starving boys and tried to keep both alive," he said, "even when the system only gave him room for one. It's the fact that you told him not to let me forget you, and I took that into my body like a wound." The result was that the war stopped being an abstract tragedy and became a chain of decisions with names attached. The cost was that Klaus had to admit his life had been built on someone else's loss. Heinrich did not look away. Klaus saw Heinrich's jaw tighten, the way a man's face tightens when he is deciding whether to punish you or accept you. The result was a silence that made the moment heavy without turning it dramatic. The cost was that Klaus had to keep going without knowing which way Heinrich would choose. "I'm not fully one thing," Klaus said, "and that used to feel like a failure." He pointed down at the city, then out towards where the sky opened. "But it's not a failure anymore. It's the sum of what happened and what I chose after. It's the family that took me in, the work I did, the children I raised, and the fact that I came back here instead of letting a name stay buried in a file box. The result was an identity defined by choices and consequences instead of flags. The cost was that Klaus took responsibility for the choice to come back, which meant he could not blame the war for everything that followed." Heinrich let out a breath that sounded like he'd been holding it for decades. "So you're both," he said, then paused and corrected himself with a blunt fairness. "Or you're neither, but you came back." The result was the closest thing to acceptance Klaus had expected to get, and it landed without romance. The cost was that acceptance still did not erase the years of distance. It only made the distance survivable. Klaus nodded once, because arguing would ruin what had just been built. He reached into his pocket and held out the folded letter, not as proof and not as a weapon, but as a shared object they could both blame instead of blaming each other. The result was that Heinrich took it and unfolded it carefully, the way you unfold something that can cut you. The cost was that Klaus watched Heinrich's eyes move across words that had haunted Klaus alone, and Klaus could not control what Heinrich would feel. Heinrich read the line about being left behind, and his face shifted, not into anger, but into recognition, as if the letter confirmed what his body had known all along. The result was that Heinrich's story and Klaus's story finally touched the same piece of paper. The cost was that paper made the separation official in a way memory never had. They stayed at the railing until the wind got colder, and neither man tried to turn the moment into a speech. Klaus asked Heinrich one practical question, where he had been sent after the split, and Heinrich answered with the kind of detail that only a lived life can provide. The name of a facility, the smell of coal smoke, the first job that paid him cash. The result was that Klaus replaced imagined Heinrich with real Heinrich. The cost was that real Heinrich included pain Klaus could not undo. When they finally walked back down, they exchanged numbers and a plan to meet again before Klaus flew out. The result was a future that existed, however small. The cost was responsibility. Once you agree to contact, you owe the contact effort, not sentiment. That night, Klaus called Irene and told her, in the simplest language he could manage, that he had found him. The result was relief in Irene's voice that Klaus could feel through the phone, because relief is contagious in families. The cost was that Irene asked the question she always asked when Klaus was tempted to drown in the past. "What are you bringing home?" And Klaus had to answer with something clear. The next morning, Klaus sat in his hotel room with a notebook, because he needed to convert the trip into something that could survive time. He started a letter addressed to his children, not because he wanted to teach them history, but because he wanted to give them a map that would spare them the confusion he had carried. The result was the beginning of a family narrative that didn't hide the ugly parts. The cost was that every sentence required a choice: what to include, what to leave out, and how to tell the truth without turning it into a burden. He wrote about Munich without describing it like a postcard. He wrote about how systems separate people, how a single list can redirect 2 lives, and how survival can feel like theft, even when you did nothing wrong. The result was a story that honored cause and consequence instead of comfort. The cost was that he had to admit, on paper, that he had spent years pretending a name didn't matter because he was afraid it did. He wrote one line from Heinrich that he knew his children would understand. "Someone was left behind, and we don't get to pretend that doesn't shape the person who was taken." The result was an honest accounting that connected his success to its hidden cost. The cost was that Klaus could no longer hide behind gratitude as a shield. Gratitude had to sit beside grief. At the airport, Klaus folded the letter to his children and placed it in his carry-on where it wouldn't get crushed. The result was a decision to carry the story forward instead of letting it fade back into silence. The cost was that carrying a story means answering questions later, and Klaus would have to be ready. When the boarding call came, Klaus stood, lifted his bag, and joined the line. He did not look back toward the city, because looking back would pull him into the old habit of searching for a street corner that no longer existed. The result was a forward motion that felt steady instead of frantic. The cost was that forward motion required letting the ghost of the past remain a ghost, not erased, but no longer in control. On the plane, he sat by the window and watched the ground shrink into patterns of fields and roads, and he pressed his palm lightly against the armrest, as if checking that the old marks were still there. The result was a quiet confirmation. The debt had not vanished, but it had changed shape. The cost was that Klaus understood he would always carry both the taking and the leaving, and he would have to keep choosing what to do with it. He closed his eyes, not to forget, but to organize. He could still hear Heinrich's voice on the viewpoint, not forgiving, not condemning, just recognizing. The result was a kind of peace that didn't feel like a reward, just a stable platform after a long time walking on broken ground. The cost was that peace came with a duty, to tell the story plainly, to live without hiding, and to make sure his children never had to dig through a file box to find the truth.